Hello, my name is Rainer Hanekamp. I am a trainer and consultant at Angular Architects, and in this video I want to show you the features that we had in Angular version 15. Now the biggest change, in my opinion, was that the standalone components, the standalone API and the NgOptimizedImage directive, that they left their status of a developer preview and became stable. So it's kind of, we don't have any excuses anymore not to use them. I will not cover them in detail here because this is something I have already done in my former videos. So if you're interested in that, please check them out. I will discuss here 3 features that were really introduced completely new in Angular 15. And these are the support for responsive images in the NgOptimizedImage directive, the provideHttpClient function, which is now part of the standalone API, and also the Directive Composition API. Let's start. Okay, so this is already the application that I will use to demonstrate all the new things. You see already there is an issue on the left side. There actually should be some buttons, but they look like links. The reason is that Angular Material, I am also using it here, had a huge change, or there is a huge change between version 14 and version 15, so you have to be aware of it if you also use Angular Material. In my case, I already executed ngUpdate. If you use NX, then you need to run nxmigrate, obviously. And what happens then is that all the imports are changed. So you see already that Angular kind of created new versions of all the existing modules that we have. And it didn't use the new version, but it used the old version and at the same time deprecated the old versions. So in this case, instead of using the real button module, the new one, I'm using here the legacy one. So everything that I actually have to do is that I just remove the legacy one. I don't need the alias here. And then from the import path, the legacy has to go as well. And then it's already working. So if I now switch back, then we will hopefully see that the buttons are now shown. And of course, I would have to do this for all my components. The reason is that there are some probably breaking changes, especially if you have overwritten some of Material's internal CSS rules. I didn't do it, so I'm quite lucky, and also my application isn't that large. So I was finished with the migration very fast. The only thing which was really troubling was the theming for me, because I've created my own theme. I used some code I found on the internet for some time, and that also broke. So you see this when you run ngserve, that there are coming some warnings from the CSS file. And if we take a look at that one, then this one here, then you see it's, kind of the wrong commands. So I mean, the colors are still there, but it's not really working anymore. I don't want to fix it right now because I have already a branch that contains all the fixes. So I'm quickly switching over, and then you will see the difference. So in the fixed branch, more or less, it looks like this. So there are now this smut defined palette. I'm calling the function in a different way. And I do this always first. So you have to come up with the theming first, and after that comes your customized CSS rules, whatever you might have. So you see here in my example, after I have defined the theme for Angular Material, I imported Tailwind. So I'm using here a combination, and then it just works fine. Right. And now let's continue with the NgOptimizedImage. All right, so responsive images for the NgOptimizedImage directive. What does this mean? The basic idea behind responsive images is that we provide a set of different sizes for a particular image to our browser, and the browser picks the one that it thinks is the best for the current device. In my opinion, this is one of the most underestimated performance tasks that you can do in terms of reducing bundle size, in terms of reducing the data that you need to transfer to your client. Why? Because most of the time we are trying to minimize our JavaScript file, so the Angular code itself. tree shaking, lazy loading, whatever might be possible. But on the other side, what we don't see is that it's very likely that our application or that the data, that there is way more data that needs to be transferred for images, and we should actually, if we want to minimize the data itself, then we should first try to prioritize and to optimize the images themselves. And only then should we go to optimizing the JavaScript bundle. Because I can guarantee you, you will gain significantly improvements if you have optimized images. That's why it's really important. Coming back to our application here, you see I'm already using images. Well, at the moment they are loaded. If we take a look, they are loaded with 4,000 pixels, which is way too large. And I want not to use the new directive with its support for responsive images to fix this. Now, as I said before, this is about using a backend service or a cloud service that is able to produce multiple image sizes. And you can write your own, or you can just reuse an existing one. And I use an existing one, which is Cloudinary. So I have an account there, I have already uploaded all my images there, and they can now provide me with different sizes of this image. And the only thing what's left for me is that I have to tell my NgOptimizedImage that I'm using Cloudinary. NgOptimizedImage is already applied here, as you can see it, by using ngSource, that property here. Before Angular 15 it was raw source, now it's ngSource. And well, you have already commented it out, so I need to tell here Angular or the directive that I want to use the Cloudinary loader. So this means Angular provides some services that understand how to communicate with these cloud services. There are actually 4 of them: Cloudflare, Cloudinary. You can look them up very quickly. ImageKit and ImageIX, or however you pronounce it. And of course, you can also write your own loader if you want, or if you have the need for it. But now I just told Angular, yeah, hey, look, I'm using Cloudinary. This is my URL, my user account, and I've stored the images in the Angular 15 path folder. So if I now go back, we will see that things are already changing, because now the image here doesn't load with 4,000 pixels anymore, but with 1,000. Where does these number come from? We need to take a look at the image itself. And we see here that there is a source set attribute. That's new. That's coming automatically from the NgOptimizedImage directive. I'm going to copy out the value. No, not that one, that one. So that we see what's in there. And you see there are 2 paths with 1x and 2x. And that means we are telling the browser, hey, look, I have 2 resolutions of this image. If you are running on a pixel density of 1, then maybe you want to use the first one, which has a width of 1103. Otherwise, go with the second one. I'm using here this emulation mode of Chrome, so I can here very easily switch between pixel densities. So I set here 1. But of course, if I would say no, I have 2, and I reload my page, I would expect that I'm getting now a higher resolution. Right, so Canada, it's now 2206. Good. So that's the basics. That's where we don't have to do anything except integrating a cloud service or our backend. But of course, it's not optimized, because if I would now say I'm going to resize the width here a little bit, then we are dealing with images that have a width of 439, and of course there's no reason why I need to download an image with 2000 pixels. And this is where I need to help Angular and also the browser a little bit, because the principle is still the same. We are providing now a larger set of different images, but I need to tell the browser the percentage regarding to the viewport that this image occupies. So the browser doesn't find this out on its own. Even theoretically, the browser could do it, but the way how the browser works is that the browser wants to download the image as soon as possible. So the browser doesn't want to wait until the rendering is completed and then it could kind of calculate how large the image might be and then download it. The browser says, hey, look, I want to start with the download as fast as possible. That's why you need to tell me the amount or the percentage regarding to the viewport that your image is occupying. And I can say, okay, maybe let's start with 80%. The way how I can do this is that I need to use the sizes attribute. So I say here sizes, I say 80 viewport. This means 80% is now occupied. If I now go back, we will see that our image source set, or that the source set value, is a little bit larger. So before we only had 2 URLs, now we have a little bit more. And this is now the range. And the browser will now pick the best image, depending, of course, on the 80% of the viewport that we have just defined. So in our case, if I take a look at it, so it's 1020. And if we check out what the download was, 2,920, which is not the best one, because there would also have been an image with 1,200, but this is something we will deal with later. Let's quickly remember the number 1,200 for 80%, and remember that the browser is downloading to an image which is a little bit too large. But we see when we are reducing it and I'm reloading the page, that it's now downloading a smaller size. Okay, so what's the problem? Why is it not, why does it kind of works but not how it should? The reason is that, first of all, I should maybe replace or switch to another density, which is 1. This is something, when you do this kind of experiments, it's always a little bit confusing, because you think you have a width, in this case of 697, but in reality you always need to calculate it times 2 because of the pixel density, so always go down to 1. It's easier to calculate with. So if I now reload it, we see it's around 640, which makes more sense. And also when it comes to the 1,200, we see that this is also now a little bit better, because the image occupies 1,008 pixels. But it's not really, it's not perfect at the moment. It will never become really perfect, but we can do better. Let's put it like this. I said 80%. Yeah, I could say this if I know that the sidebar here is 20%, but that's not the case, because the sidebar has a fixed width. So the only responsiveness that we have here is in the middle area, which is the image. And of course, if I would now go down to, I don't know, 400 pixels, then it would be 50% and not 80% anymore. So I have to do something about this. And luckily for us, that's actually very easy. I can use the calc function that you can also use for setting CSS variables. In order to do this, I need to find out the static width, because I need to subtract it from 100%. So what I want to do is that I don't want to say it's 80%, but I want to say calculate and start with 100% and then minus some kind of static pixel amount, which we have to find out now. In this case, I'm saying 10 pixels, which of course is not right. So how do we get this, or how do we find out the static width? Well, actually very easy. The image, as we see here, occupies 750 pixels, and the complete viewport is 942. So I just say here 942 minus, I've already forgotten it, 750. We end up with 192 pixels. Yeah, let's try it out. So I set this here with the calculation. And if I now reload it and check out where we are at the moment, we see it's downloading the image with 750 exactly. And now I am going to add another pixel to my viewport, because, why do I do that? Well, because 750 is already the threshold. So if we are becoming 1 pixel larger, then we should already download the next one. Yeah. So I just say here, instead of 942, I'm increasing by 1. We see a re-download has happened with 828, sorry. So that's quite good, yeah. So this is how we can deal with sizes where we have a fixed and a fluid part in your application. But that's not all of it. We also have, of course, responsive views. So it's very likely that you say, yeah, if I'm running on a large screen, I don't see the need that an image occupies 1 row. Why don't we just add 2 images in a row and we leave the 1 image per row for smaller devices? I can do that as well. So we have here a breakpoint at, let's say, 1024. That's standard coming from Tailwind itself, which means I go to my container component, which is the home component. And here you see already that I'm using a CSS grid. And here I can say, okay, starting with the large size, it says here already 1024, I want you to use 2 items per row. That's the command. Okay, so we are here with below 1024, and now I'm going to increase it, increase it, increase it, and now it jumps over, right? Good. If we look now at the image, we see it's 413 in reality. And what did we use? Well, 1080, 1080. That's of course wrong. We also understand why, because the browser still thinks the image is occupying the complete width, except the sidebar, of course. What can we do? Well, we just apply media queries as we also do it in normal CSS. The way how it goes, that I say here, okay, this with the 100%, that only applies with a max width until 1023 pixels, then calculate with 100%, and if that's not the case, everything that goes beyond that, you just say 100 minus the static amount dividing by 2, and then you should reach the optimized pixel amount for 2 images in a row. Okay? So I'm going back. Let's see. 640, that's way better. Of course, it also means now, if I'm now going to reduce it, that we end up very quickly in an image which is much larger. So the browser would actually request a larger image for a smaller width of the viewport, of course. So if I do this, quick check here the networks, you should see that a re-download is happening. Yep. So here we had Canada with 640. Now Canada has 827, which is not optimal with 640. And that's why we ended up with 1080, right? So that's the next threshold. Again, we had here 828. That should actually have worked. But yeah, it can of course be 1 pixel below or above. Shouldn't be a problem here. It just went with 1080. Yeah, we can of course also try it out if I really increase it a little bit more, and that we really verify that we are downloading the 820 and not the 1080. Yeah, as you see, now we are at 828. Good, good. So this is already quite optimized. But are we done yet? No. There is one very important problem left to fix. And that's when we are going into the opposite direction, namely where we are increasing the viewport. Let's say we are on a very large screen, which has a 4000 pixel of width. Yeah, the font size is of course messed up. Let's ignore that for now, but let's verify how large the image actually is. The images we are downloading here are 1920, although we know that it only occupies 540 pixels. That's way too much what we are downloading here. That's everything except optimized. So what we can do again is applying a media query. So I say here, this calculation that we have here, that one should only apply until we reach, how should I say, until the viewport has kind of the size as the main container here, because you can clearly see here that the application doesn't grow beyond a certain point of pixels, and that's at the moment 1280. So beyond that, there is no space that the application provides for my images, and that's why the image sizes are fixed. 1280, that's the number. So I say again, I have a max width of 1079 pixels, and starting from 2080, I want to provide a limit, because beyond that, it should just be 570 pixels, or 75, I think it was, doesn't matter. But this is where I can define, or where I can limit the width of the images, and make sure that the browser doesn't load the high resolution images, because it doesn't need them. Let's try it out. Okay, we see there is a problem. This is a common problem that you find with the NgOptimizedImage directive. Why? Because normally, coming from the sizes, I mean, sizes is a standard HTML attribute. It's not an attribute of the directive, but the NgOptimizedImage directive, of course, understands it. And based off the information that we are providing here, it is generating the source set. But the problem is, it's not very happy when we are providing static units. Pixels are static units. It wants to have responsive values, as it says here. So it only wants to have a viewport, or in regard to comparing to the font size, sorry, in relation to the font size, something like that, but not pixels. It says, yeah, it looks like you have a more complex use case, then you can, of course, write your own source set. I don't want that. I want to use the NgOptimizedImage, and that's why I can apply a small hack here. But before that, let me quickly check how large the image really is. It should be 548. Oh, okay, 48. Good. And the trick that I need to apply now, in order to avoid the pixel, I need to mix it with a responsive value. This means I again say I want to use the calc function. I say we have 100 viewport minus 100% of the viewport, so we end up with 0, and then I just add the static value of the pixels, and looks like our Angular directive is happy with that. Let's check it out. Yeah, images are there. And of course, I now increase it again to 4000, reload, and let's see what we are downloading. 640. Wonderful. So that's what we actually wanted. It is important to note that I'm not saying here that the image shouldn't be larger than 448. Of course, I mean, if I have a larger pixel density, then that's another topic. What I'm saying here, regardless of the pixel density, it's 448 pixels. Which means, long story short, if I would increase, let's go down a little bit to 1300 again. If I would increase here my pixel density, we could expect that now a higher resolution is used, 1080 in this case. Okay? And that's actually the way how it works. So I've spent now a little bit more time on responsive images, although it's not really a particular Angular feature. It's kind of a combination together with the directive. But I think it's really important that we optimize our images. We can do this with this directive now. It makes us aware, hey, look, you have all necessary tools available in order to do this. So please take care of it if you have the need before you start optimizing your JavaScript bundle size. Take a look at your images. Maybe you get a better result in less time, which is of course also very fun, very nice. Okay, that's it about the NgOptimized image directive, and now we'll move on to the provideHttpClient. Okay, about the provideHttpClient function. Let me quickly show you the use case. So we have here in our application a holidays menu. When I click on it, then we see that our holidays cards are shown. We will deal with them later. But the important information for us is that there is a request going to some kind of URL, API, eternalholidays.net. I am using already standalone components, so this means that I'm not using an app module anymore, but I still have to use an HTTP client, and for that, until version 15, I always had to import the HTTP client module in some way. In my case, it was actually part of the main TS. So inside of our main TS, we see that there is an import providers from HTTP client module. That means that Angular says, okay, give me all the services that this HTTP client module provides, and I'm going to provide it in the root scope. We had already kind of a similar use case with provideRouter, which was already fixed in version 14. And you see there how it works. So instead of importing or use import providers from, I just say provideRouter, provide my routing configuration, and I don't need to use the router module anymore. It's just gone away. And the same thing can also be done for the provideHttpClient. So I see here, provideHttpClient, and it looks like that's it already. Let's check out the application. We see there is a problem. It's not loading from the original domain anymore, it's loading from localhost 4200. Why that? There is a base URL interceptor. What does it do? The base URL interceptor is actually responsible for providing the right domain. The domain in my case is configured in the environment. In this case, it comes indirectly via a config service. But you see, in this interceptor, I check if it's a relative or an absolute URL. If it's a relative one, so it's missing HTTP in this case, then I just say I add the base URL and of course what the caller has here requested. That worked until I came up with provideHttpClient, because now it's obviously not working. And then we also have another one, which is a loading interceptor. As the name says, the loading interceptor is something, we can take a look at it very quickly. It's something that uses a loading service. So it's kind of a stateful loading information. So I tell here, when a request comes in, I tell my loading service, hey look, I'm now starting to load. And if a response comes back, regardless if it's an error or if it's a successful response, I always say set loaded, so that the service is aware that nothing's loaded anymore. And of course, I have somewhere in my application, which we don't see at the moment because it's obviously not working, I have some progress bar, which is showing me a loading indication. Yeah, why is it not working? I mean, they are there, we have our interceptors there. They are right here. The reason is I need to activate them in my provideHttpClient function. And there is a function for it, which is called with interceptors from DI. Why DI and why not just interceptors like this? Because this is a function that also exists. This exists for something else, for the new interceptors. The old ones that we see here are actually from DI. So if I do that, then the normal interceptors will be picked up. And if I go back and my application reloads, we'll see it's working. And not just that, you also see the progress bar. So let me quickly throttle a little bit the speed. So if I go, you see here that the progress, there was some progress shown. So this comes from the loading interceptor. Well, I mean, What's about the interceptors from the eye and normal interceptors? What are the new ones? The new ones are just functions. These are functional interceptors. As we have them already with the router, where we can provide router guards just as pure functions, we can now do the same with the HTTP client or with the HTTP interceptors. So what do I have to do? It's actually quite easy. You just create a function. So I say here export const base URL interceptor, and that's from its type, that's an HTTP interceptor function. And now I can just copy the intercept function, because it always, most of the cases with an HTTP interceptor, it was just one function. Same with the guards. I add it here. Also need to do something like this. This is something I'm going to remove. And actually, I also don't need to provide the types here because the interceptor function includes them already. So if I remove it here, you see that they are already shown with the right type. And the handle or the next is now kind of a handler function itself. So it's not an object anymore, it's just a pure function. So I don't need to call handle anymore. Also here. What do I do about my config service? That's one that comes via the dependency injection. Well, I just use the new inject function. So I need to use it here. So I need to say here, config service, give me the config service, please. You can let go of this here, also of the hash. No need for private anymore. And I have a fully functional interceptor that I can use right away. So I go back to my main TS and can remove that one. And here I say provide, I say with interceptors, and I provide an array where I say base URL interceptor. Like this. So here we are. Everything compiles. Let's see if it's working. Reload. Wonderful. Holidays are there. We are more or less done. Of course, I could now also move on and migrate the loading interceptor, but you see here already you can also mix it. So it's not necessary that you switch to functional interceptors immediately. You can do this regularly or step by step. It's better, but we are not done yet. There is something else. There is an edge case that you should be aware of, and that comes with lazy loaded modules. So we have here a customers module that again just shows a list of existing customers. See it here, so nothing fancy. But if I go into the routing configuration of my customers, you see there is actually quite a lot going on. So we have here an import providers from, we have a customer service that I am providing, and we have again interceptors. The question now is, why do I have again the loading interceptor? And what's the customer's interceptor doing here? So actually, why do I actually need all that stuff? The reason here is that somebody said, let's just use it like that. So that somebody said all my requests coming in that are kind of sent out in the customers module, they should all have automatically the customer as part of the URL. Which was the reason why I need to provide this interceptor only in the customers module. So we see here that I say here, yeah, it's the base URL together with the customer and then everything what the caller wants to have. So that means the customer service, which is the only service in this case that is going, that is communicating with the backend. You see, it just needs to have an empty string because everything else is already added by the interceptor. Good, but still, I mean, why can't I just do it like this? That I just say, okay, why do I need to use the loading interceptor? Why do I have to import providers from HTTP client module when it's already available in the root scope? What's the problem? Yeah, if I leave it like this, we will see what the problem is. First of all, I think we will have an issue with the customer service itself because it's not provided in root. So I can do that. Or let me just provide it here. Let's see the difference. We see the loading interceptor is kind of working. So this was coming from the root one because I have already disabled that with the one from the lazy loaded module. But still I'm not getting any data. And the reason for that is that now, although it is activated, my customer's interceptor doesn't work. So I can of course also check it out. So I can say here, what's the problem here? Debugger, like this. And you will see that nothing happens because it's not activated. And the reason for that is that, first of all, if I'm not providing an own instance of the HTTP client in that module, then these interceptors will not just be picked up by anybody. So the first thing that I have to do is that I have to come up with my own instance. Second, all the interceptors of a lazy loaded module, only they will be used and not the other ones. So the base URL interceptor or the loading interceptor, because I'm now using own instances in my lazy loaded module, so the loading interceptor will not be used, and also not the base URL interceptor, which would now mean that the loading progress is not shown, but the request still works. Let's go back, reload the page. Yeah, we see the debugger turns on. Now we see here a list, but the progress bar wasn't there, right? So I have to be very careful here. So if I really want to have an interceptor only for a module, then I need to first of all create an own instance of the HTTP client in that module. I have to be aware that none of my root interceptors are working anymore. We saw this here because I have actually also include the base URL because the base URL interceptor doesn't work anymore. And third, all your services that are dealing with that particular customer's HTTP client also needs to provide it in that module. If I would comment the customer service out, and if I would say the customer service is now actually provided in root, then it would get it would get the root HTTP client that doesn't have the new interceptors, which means if I now load it, that the loading indicator will work. Customers, yeah, you see it here. Loading indicator is working because we are in the root scope. But of course, the request is the wrong one because nobody has added the customers to it. That's the problem. I guess not many of you have this kind of feature, but I think first of all it's good especially for the ones that have it, and also for those who don't have it, that you see a little bit how these dependency injection works together with lazy loaded modules, especially that it can be very dangerous. So how do we fix it? Yeah, I can just leave it as it is, like add here removing the provided in root again from the customer service, and then just say provide HTTP client with interceptors from DI. This would be a possibility. So I say here with interceptors from DI, but there is a better way how to do it. But let's quickly check if it's now working. So need to slow down maybe a little bit. What I just did is that I'm providing now the HTTP client in the new way. The customer service is still also lazily loaded, so it's not provided in the scoop, in the root, which means the interceptors from the customer's module will be applied to the customer service and also to the HTTP client. Right, so we will not see any loading indication, but at least the data is there because the URL is the right one. That's what we can expect now. So I say here customers, debugger goes on, wonderful. And let me quickly get rid of this debugger. Don't need it. And it's now more or less about the loading thing. the loading interceptor. So I say slow 3G. And you see no loading progress is showing there. In comparison, when I click on holidays, well, it needs to be lazy loaded. Takes some time. Yeah, you see the progress bar is there. So for that it's working, but not for customers anymore. Right. The way what you can do now with the new features is that you can kind of connect the scopes together. There is a function that does this. The function is called with requests made via parent. If you add this one, then this means that all the interceptors from your root scope, in our case, I mean, it's technically correct, it's via the parent, but in our case, the parent is the root scope. This is not a lazily loaded module, which is used by another lazily loaded module. That's why it's the root scope. And then we should actually get the loading interceptor. And what does this now mean for the base URL interceptor? Because now we have two interceptors coming together to try to manipulate the URL. Will there be a problem? No, I don't think so, because that one goes first, the customer's interceptor, and that one adds already an HTTP to the URL, and that's why the base URL interceptor will not interfere here anymore. So it will work, but of course you have to be aware of that it's not, well, I mean, we have now two interceptors clashing together. Actually, what we could do, I think this is maybe a better solution, that I say, okay, I know in my customer's interceptor that the base URL interceptor is already adding the base URL. So the only thing that I really have to do, that I just add here the /customers. Of course, this means that the customer's interceptor, or that the interceptors from the lazy loading modules are executed first, because otherwise the URL would look a little bit strange. But that's the case, and we see already it didn't change anything. So the base URL interceptor did its work, as well as the customer's interceptor, and everything is now working. But again, this was kind of a very special case, I would say. If you're interested in more of that, I would highly recommend you to watch a video of our meetup, where we have introduced Angular 15 already, and there Manfred Steyer explains this way better. He also uses slides to give you a better understanding how all of this works internally. Just check that out. And for this video, we just stop it right here, and we say that's enough for the provideHttpClient, and we will move on to the Directive Composition API. All right, about the Directive Composition API. So we have here, as you already know, we have here these holiday cards. And if we take a look at them, or edit, because it's just one component, but only used multiple times, we see that on its root diff, it is using two different directives. It's using an app blinker, and it's using test ID, which is also a directive. What is the app blinker doing? Well, the app blinker is just responsible when I hover with my mouse over the holiday card, that it just starts to flash. So it just changes the color, as you see. And the test ID is something which I use for testing. So what does it do? It adds nothing else than just a data test ID attribute to it. So this is something that I can then use for selecting this element. Why don't I write data test on my own? Why do I come up with an own directive? Well, because maybe I don't want to have a data test ID attribute in my production systems. So the directive is aware of that and can enable or disable it depending on the configuration. The Directive Composition API makes these kind of use cases way easier, because I can now say, hey, look, instead of me applying manually the directive to this root tag here, I can just get rid of it. And I say here, downwards, host directives, and I want to use the blinker directive like this, right? And this is something I can remove. And that means now that this blinker directive is applied by Angular itself, but not to the div element, but to the host component. That's why it's called host directive. What's the host component? The host tag. The host tag is actually the selector tag. So if we take a look here, we see that it's the app holiday card. It's not the div anymore, it's really the app holiday card. So if I hover with my mouse over it, you see that the style attribute is changed in that tag and not in the div, which is the first child. Good, but that's not all of it, of course. There is more to come. I can now, as holiday card, I can now say I want to provide access, not access, but I can provide the access to the input properties of that directive to my parent elements. Because the blinker directive has a property where I can define the interval. So I can define how fast it should flash. So you see this here, I'm storing here an empty string, and the default value would be 500 milliseconds. And this is something I can change. And now I don't want that my holiday card changes it, but I want to provide this possibility to my parent component. So the way how this works is that I have to change the value here a little bit. I need to say it's a directive blinker directive, because now I also have access to inputs. And here I can say I am exposing the app blinker property of that blinker directive to the parent. If I write it like this, there is a syntax error. But if I run it like this, nothing really will change. It is still hopefully blinking, right? But of course, I can now go to my parent component, which are the holidays component. Here it is. Here it's looping over the holiday cards. Well, and here I can say app blinker, and I say 100. So app blinker would now actually be a directive, but I don't need to import the directive here. It's just a feature, or in other ways put, the holiday card made it as its own feature. So it's kind of hiding it internally, or it's not internally, it's hiding the fact to its parent that this is a feature actually coming from another directive. And for the parent element, it looks like that blinking is a native feature of the holiday card itself. So it makes it a little bit easier. And of course it works. So if I now hover with my mouse over it, we clearly see that this new setting has been applied and that it works as it should be. And in the same way, of course, I can also apply multiple directives. I'm not just limited to one. My holiday card can do the same thing for the test ID that we have seen here. So I can get rid of the test ID here. I also don't need to import it like here. And I just say here, okay, I have a directive. This is the test ID directive. And as I've done with my app blinker with the input, I need to do the same thing here again. So I say here, I am exposing that test ID. Yeah. So if I now go to my parent component, I can say test ID without importing any other directive. It's just functionality from the holiday card component itself. And I say that's the holiday card, that's the test ID. And again, as we have seen, this value now is really applied to the host tag itself. So the data test ID attribute is now here and not here anymore. One thing, of course, which is now also important is you can also expose the outputs. Yes, I'm not going to do it because I don't have here any, but you can rename it. You can provide aliases for these inputs and outputs. So I could, for example, say, well, app blinker is not a very good name. It doesn't speak for itself because in the end it's about the interval. Now I can say, okay, then I just call it blinker interval. And this now means that my parent component, when it says app blinker, that will not have any effect anymore. But if it uses the blinker interval, then it's internally translated to the app blinker itself. This was kind of a very complicated explanation for a very easy thing, actually. I don't know why I always make it more complicated than it is already. Yeah, so I just need to say here blinker interval, and that will do the job. Yeah. Actually, yeah, quite straightforward. There is one last thing which is important. In the host directives, you can only use directives that are standalone. So you can't use an ng module here, this will not work. And I think this is already kind of a sign that, of course, Angular says, yeah, you can of course always use the ng modules, but we see already that and of course this will add up in the future, that there will be more and more features coming that are only exclusively available for standalone components. So yeah, please be aware of it. Again, the standalone components, they are already production ready, so they are not in the developer preview status anymore. Okay, so that's it about the Directive Composition API. When are they useful? Yeah, to be honest, the applications that I use most of the time, I don't have so many self-written UI components. As you have seen, I'm already using Angular Material, and in most cases, when I have UI components, I wouldn't apply the blinker directive or the test ID directive in the UI component here, but I would actually always do it via the container component. So it would actually be that component importing and applying the directive and not the UI component on its own. So in most cases, I don't really have a use case for the Directive Composition API, but I know when you are, for example, somebody who's working on a UI library as Angular Material, or if you have an application where quite a larger portion consists of UI components, then I can think, or then I'm sure that this Directive Composition API will be a huge improvement for your work, and that you will be, how should I put it, much more excited about it than I am. It's useful, but of course, in my case, I don't have so many use cases. Okay, so that's it. About the three main features, I would say that are very important. Again, the responsive support, responsive images support for the NgOptimizedImage directive, the provideHttpClient, and also the Directive Composition API. There are, of course, further new features. There is one kind of a tiny utility feature, I would even say, which I don't want to hide from you, and that's the default export in routes, lazy loaded modules. So for example, if I say here I have my holiday routes, the file, then I don't need to export that one like export const. I can make a default export, which means I have to say export default holiday routes, and this has now the advantage that in my routes where I'm importing it, I don't need to use the then anymore, because if I leave this out, then Angular says, okay, you're importing that file, so what should I do? I check if there is a default export, then I'll pick that one. If not, then you have a problem. And in most cases, these routes files, they are just exporting one element, so it's not an issue if we do a default export. And as you see, it saves us, not that much, but it's definitely an improvement. Small steps also can make up something large. So be aware of it and just implement it in your code base. Further features I'm not going to discuss here. For that, please check out the official changelog. Other blog posts, there is also an official blog post from the Angular team. I'm going to link them in the description of this video. All right, so version 15, in my opinion, was kind of a complementary version to version 14, which was really revolutionizing. But with 15, we got some 15 brought in more stability of all these new features and prepared the framework itself for the next things to come. What are these? Well, we know that Angular is currently working, or the Angular team is currently working on bringing in more reactivity, also including optional Zone.js, and also improvements in the area of server-side rendering / hydration. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, just add them into the comment section. If you're interested in more videos, then please subscribe to my channel. Be happy. And yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.